Welcome to KidSketch, where today we travel to downtown San Diego to the Santa Fe Depot. Union Station, as it's also known, has served residents and visitors to San Diego for more than a century, and it shows little sign of slowing down. This major transportation hub is often among the top 10 busiest stations in the national Amtrak network. The Santa Fe Depot was designed by architects Bakewell and Brown to welcome the many anticipated visitors to the 1915 Panama, California Exposition in Balboa Park. The architectural style of the depot was intended to harmonize with the Spanish colonial revival style buildings of the Exposition, which drew tens of thousands of visitors from early 1915 to the end of 1916. The original concept for the depot combined an open-air waiting room or patio and a long covered concourse, enclosing the patio and uniting the design elements. The main approach was from Broadway through a courtyard to the large arched forecourt with its glazed window above the entrance doors to the waiting room. Unfortunately, the courtyard structures were demolished in the 1970s to make room for a parking lot. But back to that front entrance. The notable exterior features are the Great Arch, flanked by twin campaniles of Spanish Renaissance flavor, with delightfully colored tiled domes capped by tiled lanterns. The interiors are notable for their grand scale, with 9 arched elements and natural redwood beam and purlin ceilings. The main waiting room measures 165 feet by 55 feet wide and 50 feet high. The interior walls have handsome, brightly colored tile wainscoting with plaster above 8 feet and are penetrated by arched clear-story windows near the ceiling. You will find these interesting features still there today. The original clay tile flooring in 2 sizes and colors, the original long oak benches, and still in beautiful condition, those interior chandeliers of bronze and glass, and the wood frame doors with their hand-carved lettering on transom scrolls. And of course, the wainscoting tile, which was made originally in National City. When you stand inside the lofty waiting room under its graceful arches and redwood beams and those huge high windows at either end, you get a feeling of reverence. It's like being in a church. Because the interior is so impressive, let's try our hand at sketching it. While we'll be sketching what we see, let's employ a few rules of perspective to help us along the way. The concept of perspective is that objects closer to us appear larger and objects farther away from us appear smaller. When those objects get so far away, they seem to vanish. The easiest way to illustrate perspective in real life is to stand in the middle of a straight road, being careful not to get hit by a car. When you do this, you'll notice how the sides of the road and the lines painted on it meet in one spot on the horizon. And the center line will go straight for that spot, and the lines on the side will angle in until they intersect. That point of intersection is called the vanishing point. The vanishing point will always be in line with your eye level as you look at something. It's also called the horizon line in perspective drawings. The orthographic projection lines are the lines that recede back to the vanishing point. And they'll do that whether they're above or at eye level line or below it. An interior one-point perspective has all the same elements as that of an exterior perspective. We start with the face of the building. In this case, it's the interior wall at the back of a room. It'll have a horizon line or an eye level line. It'll have the projection lines that'll lead back to or generate from the vanishing point. And that vanishing point is going to be on your eye level line. It's usually the point you're looking straight at. So these orthographic projection lines go back to that point. We're going to block out the window, and then we can project the windows onto the sidewalls. The rules apply for all lines that are parallel. They radiate out from the vanishing point. We can show our boards on the ceiling radiating out, and the same with the wood planks on the floor. For our interior space today, it will follow the same concepts. We're going to identify the back wall, which just happens to have an arched top. We'll identify its vanishing point and the projection lines. And even the top of the arch, as all the arches line up, will have a projection line. Keep in mind that objects farther away from us appear smaller and objects closer to us appear larger. And we will lay those arches out, making them larger as they get closer to us. And the fact that our vanishing point is off to one side makes our composition a bit more interesting, less static. We'll add a few other details to help identify a little more about the space, and we'll put in the arch top doors there below and the clear story windows up above, and we'll find where those light fixtures are hanging from. You can easily see they get smaller and closer together the farther back they go. So your space will start taking shape and it'll start to make some sense. I'm going to try something a little different today with our image. I find that there's a lot of information in this, and it can be pretty time consuming if you're sketching a lot of the details. And so I'm going to fold back the photo to eliminate some of this outer, the closest arch, as I've done here. It'll focus my attention on some of the more important pieces. So we start with the back wall. I'm going to start by making a circle. I'm keeping my pencil pretty light because sometimes it takes a couple attempts to make a circle. I'm going to draw a line right through the middle of it. I'm going to make another little circle, actually a half circle, just to the outside of that first circle. All right, so what we've tried to do is to put in that back window, but you see it's more of a segment. So come up just a little bit from that center line and draw another line. That'll be the bottom of the window itself. And then a line about equidistant below that midline. And that's going to be this light colored soffit there at the ticket office. All right. From this outer circle, let's just bring that down a little bit. Let's then establish this wall, its width and its height. So it comes out past the circle you can eyeball it, you could measure it. It looks like I can see that the edge of this second arch and that vertical solid piece in the window is about my lead, and halfway through the wood part is about the same distance to the end of the soffit. So if I can just visually look at it and see what that relationship is. Make that mark over there. It's a sketch. It doesn't, we're not going to break out the ruler and put it to scale, but it helps to start to get it approximately in the right place. Okay, the next thing, we could do the bottom of the wall. It looks to me as if, and the people are in the way. We can't really see, but it looks like the bottom of the wall is where all these windows are and the ticket counter is. Looks like it's about twice what that clear soffit is. So if you make another line there. Okay, this represents the corner of the room down there, which we can't see. Let's see if we can't identify where our vanishing point is. Let's put in this information stand. The edge of it aligns with this solid part in the window. The right edge of it seems to come down over here. That gold information band lines up with our ticket counter soffit. And then it looks like it's about twice the height of the rest of the wall. Now the vanishing point is in the middle there, and we can figure out the vanishing point by just tracing back some of these orthographic projection lines. And we'll get a point right about there, which looks like it's right about here. So if you can make a dot, your vanishing point, right about that point. Okay, from here, let's do a few projection lines, and then we can start putting our arches in. There's an important point in here where the arch stops being round and it becomes part of the wall. It becomes part of this pilaster. So there's that magic point where it stops being vertical and it starts arching, and that is called a spring line. The spring line for these columns need to be identified. Looks to me as if the spring line is above the soffit, about the same thickness of the soffit, if that makes sense. So what I'd like us to do is come over here to our soffit area and go up an equal distance, make a point there. Now we're going to do a projection line from our vanishing point. Feel free to use a straight edge here. It could be the edge of a piece of paper, because you probably have an extra one of those. You may not have a straight edge or a ruler. So that's an important point. Let's do the floor. Even though we can't see it now, we're going to need the floor sketched in. And while we're at it, let's do the tops of the doors. Great. Now let's get this arch. It's the second arch, or the second rib, as we come away from that back wall. We're going to eventually be doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'll show you how to space them. You can eyeball your spacing, but there might be a trick I can show you that might make it easier. So because these are full arches, the width of it is going to be twice the height. We know that the arch starts at this spring line, and we should probably identify the spring line on the other side. These are all so close together that I think it'll be just fine to make just a couple of lines very close together. And so this is our second arch, so make a second line. You see I have 1 line, 2 lines. You could do all of them right now if you wanted, 3, 4, 5. So that second line, try to identify its halfway point. And how do you do that? Eyeball it. So just draw a line that you think is in the middle, and then just check yourself. Pretty close. All right, and if half the width is the height, there's your height. Take a stab at that circle. All right. Then to find that inner rib, remember in perspective, things closer to us are larger and things farther away are smaller. And that goes for the spacing of things. So the space you see between the back wall and the first rib is going to be smaller than the space between this first rib and the second rib. So you could just find your halfway point and say, okay, I'm going in just a little. Your arch starts from the spring line. And find the halfway point between these two, but come in just a little. That works. There was another way to find that spacing. You see this, there's a rectangle that forms, not exactly a rectangle because only two lines are parallel. These two lines are parallel. And we have the spring line radiating there, and then the line from the bottom of the soffit, which is the top of the doors, created that line. If you were to make an X through this funny little rectangle, where the two crosses meet, that's your midpoint. And look, we guessed well. All right, here's a fun trick. Take that midpoint and project it out. Okay, you have that? Then we're going to make a few more X's. We're going to start at this point down here. That is the middle of that first X. And we're going to make a diagonal through this line. Give it a try. Just follow the steps. It may sound confusing. And so its outer pieces where it's hitting these other lines, that becomes the next bay. Let's keep going and see if we can't space all 5 of these. You don't really have to do both X's, but and that's going to give us the spacing there. The next thing that we can do is maybe get the bottom of all those arches. So on this right side, we didn't project up the spring line. Which will also follow the rules of perspective. So this next spring line, if you take it across, nice steady line, do the next spring line, and the next. Okay, now we're going to make some more arches. All right. There's a couple ways that you can do this. Usual way is to eyeball it. So there's also another thing we can do. We know with this arch, we know where its center was. We located it. Well, the centers of all these arches are going to line up. The apex, the top center line of all these arches are going to line up. So let's try this. Keep in mind that these are just sort of rules or shortcuts that you can try until the time comes when you can eyeball something accurately. And these are tricks that I use still just to check my work. Okay, for this next arch, this guy's spring line, and there's its center line. Its center line goes up and meets that point. So let's draw another half circle. Remember, they come back pretty close to where the other ones are. I find if I turn my book, I can use my hand almost like a compass. I move from my wrist. I don't know if you can see that. It's a little harder to get a good circle when I'm just pushing up. Looks pretty good. Let's do the next one. It's spring line. We drew across. We already marked it the last time. And the center of it, and then straight up where its top meets. Let's give it a try. I'm going to turn my book and see if I can sketch it a little more easily. So the circles are just getting a little bigger each time, and they're offset from one another. All right, let's do this fifth one. Now's a good time to look at your sketch and to compare it with the photos. I think we're doing pretty well. Let's clean up a couple lines now. We can get rid of these vertical ones, these center lines of the arches. And we can erase the spring lines that we were using for reference. The things that you want to keep, of course, are your arches. I think I've erased a little too much of that back wall. You'll notice that these ribs have some depth to them. We've drawn them as just one line, and let's identify which side that we've sketched. Pick a side. We're going to go in and add some depth to these guys. Let's start with the outer one. We came down to our spring line, and then this is our column. Should we go in or out? Let's go out. Make a second line from the spring line down to the floor. And then make another line, go straight up with it, just to the left of that. Go all the way up. We'll figure out how tall it is pretty soon. That's that corner. And then what we're identifying is the face of this, and we'll find the slope of that roof. We're only going to need it a couple of times, but we'll do that in a minute. But from here, we're going to add another arch that's going to be that face. So until you get to the center point, make a second radius that parallels it, like that, because you can see pretty much the whole face. And then when we come down to here, they're going to get closer and closer together. This side is really foreshortened. So can you see that? Do the same thing with this column. Make that face thin. This is the far face. Don't make that column quite as wide as this first one, because it's receding in the back, so there's things in farther away or smaller. Then do the same thing. Make an arc that follows the first one that you sketched, about parallel, till you get to that midpoint. And then on this side, it's going to start closing in on itself. Okay? Let's do the same for this one. Its column's getting a little narrower. You're just eyeballing it. If you need to adjust your radius a little bit, you're still in pencil, hopefully light. This guy over here, which is where the parapet hits, you can lighten him up a little. Got a lot of things going on there that time. Oops. Actually, don't forget to give the column first before you add the wall behind him. And that flat face of these arches, they're getting closer and closer to where this last one, they're really close together. Oops. And then that rib against the wall, there will be a second little line. It's part of the wall, but you're going to, you'll give it just ever so slight thickness. Might as well do it while I'm... All right, and that one against the wall. This is where, if you're going to get that fine a detail, you need a pretty sharp pencil. Now let's try to identify the top of these walls, where the walls hit the ceiling. So we don't really see the ceiling much, except for in these first bays. Taking this fifth one that's closest to us, we see just a little bit. And I'm going to suggest that we just eyeball. We could also take our pencil and find that angle from the vanishing point and approximate it. Looks pretty good there. And that line is going to angle back, and every time it hits one of these walls, you'll see a little bit of ceiling. It's not an exact science, and I'm seeing a little more ceiling in some of these bays than what's actually in the picture. That's just the nature of sketching. So then let's put that ceiling in. Boy, that's an odd angle. What do we think? If we use our pencil to approximate the angle and try to carry it over, we can put it in there. Now on this first, this rib, which is actually this outer rib, we would see where it starts to come back down. Underneath it, we don't see where it starts to come back down. And then each time it gets a little smaller and a little smaller and a little smaller. Looking here, let's sketch in the purlins. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. On this outer one, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the ridge beam. you can just space on 1, 2, 3, 4. Or if you did on this one, you can just barely see the 4th. So it tells you where it is. Then take those lines, because they're parallel. The purlins are parallel to one another. Take them back to the vanishing point. This is a little detail that you might find just too tedious to bother with. I'm showing you how I would do it, and you can decide whether you would like to or not. So we'll do the windows and the doors next. The tops of the doors are arched, and then we've sketched in the line where the doors and the arches meet. I'm going to show you another trick of how to make these arches so that they're don't look like they're falling over. All right, first of all, we need to find the tops. We could say that the tops are almost all the way to the spring line of the other arches. So let's just find a point in between the top of the soffit. We're going to find a point in between the top of the soffit and that spring line there. And that line is going to be the top of our arched doors. All right, so we'll take this first bay, draw an X in it, because we want to know where the center line is. So that center line, hopefully there's more space on the left side of it than the right. This one didn't quite look like there was. And so when you find that center line, that's the top of the arch. There should be more arch to the left of each of those because they're closer to us. Okay, then we'd see a little bit back here and a tiny bit in that last bay. Now the windows, those clear story windows up there. Can you approximate? Can we find the angle? We're going to do the lamps next. Just find your line. You don't see the windows in too many of those bays, mostly because the chandeliers are going to get in the way. For the chandeliers, let's start by finding where they're hanging from on each of these arches. The things that are going to line up are all of these. They're in a row. We can identify those. These are going to line up as well. So let's start by finding the little dots on the arches. And for this very first rib, it looks like it's just lining up with the edge of that solid piece in the window. Okay, take it up, find your first arch. And then take your straight edge, your piece of paper or your ruler, whatever you're using for your straight edge. Draw a line like that. That's going to be the little hanging thing in each of these. Ideally, they are getting farther apart as they come closer to you. You can see my spacing isn't exactly right, so that means I don't exactly have my arches spaced right, but I'm going to be okay with it. This is a sketch. Okay, let's do the next row. It's to the left of this solid piece. So going over, it's another way you could find it, which is just to go straight across here and find out where it lands. But just to the left of that, no, I think I'm going to suggest that we do it this way. And now to find the next row of lights. They're coming from the ceiling over here. So we find our line, make a projection line. If you're seeing the ghost of some light fixtures that look like they were already in there and got erased, it's because I showed you how to put them in and then I forgot to record it, so I did erase them. So there's our 5 light attachments to the ceiling. And then from there, let's start with this guy. The chain comes down. It looks like the actual lamp is hanging just below the window, right, it's above the spring line. Go ahead and just approximate. Take a little rectangle with a little curved bottom. This, and then the projection lines from, so that light fixture is going to serve as our example. The rest of them hang down and get smaller and smaller following those lines. So if you come down from the ceiling, you meet your diagonal lines. There are your 5 light fixtures. Maybe compare where they hang to that back wall. Looks like we're pretty good. This last one, maybe not. Good enough. So then on this other side, we'll do the same thing. See how far he hangs down. If you want to start with the back one, you can start with the 5th one. We're ignoring these 2 light fixtures because they're on ribs that we haven't sketched. So we're going to just concentrate on this 5th one. It comes down, bottom of the light is about above the window. And then the projection lines so that they get smaller and smaller. They don't touch each other, so one way to know if you've got them too tall is if you don't see a little space between them. As they get smaller, they get to be just little slivers. There we go. And in some ways, those second ones, the second row, did a little better. They were a little sliver-like. These, I think I might have gotten a little too big. All right. Okay, doors, lights. How about some benches? For the benches, the challenge is to make them not look like they're just floating in space. It's helpful to have the end of the bench in profile. We can't really see because luggage is in the way. It's got a square back and flat arms. You can see a little bit over here of what I'm talking about. So if we were able to draw the sort of the wall of that, the profile of the bench, And we'll just be able to project our lines back to the vanishing point. Here's the challenge. Where is it in space? We could try to do the small end, but let's just see if we can't get this bench in. Look, it's just below this middle door. We know that it's looking like it's just below here. How far below there? Well, the top of it, what can we compare it with? The top of it's not quite as far as the bottom of the information stand. Looks like it's just a little bit below where we think our door is, just a little bit. So let's try putting it here. There's the top of our bench. Its bottom of it looks like in width it's about the same of its height. And it slopes back a little. How do you feel about that? So I'm going to try to compare where it is with some other things that. Now let's take our projection lines back. So from the back of the bench, the front of the bench, the end of it, at least where the light is catching it, looks like it's just to the left of that vertical. So let's try to end it there. And then you'll draw something that mimics this shape, connecting your lines. It's actually, I think, 3 benches, so somewhere along the way, go ahead and divide it into a couple. I'm not that good of a people sketcher, or at least I haven't taken the time to try to perfect people sketching. So for now, we're going to leave it with just objects, even though there's a lot of people in the train station that day. If you'd like to try to sketch them in, go ahead. I think that looks pretty good. How do you feel about yours? Let's erase a few of these lines and see. Did that seem easy enough? Do you want to try a second bench? The one over here? You can't see the end of it. It's cut off from the photo. I think even before I folded the photo over, I'm not sure we could have seen the end of it. Well, that's not true. You could, if you have your whole photo, if you haven't unfolded it, you can just see the edge of the bench. They would have lined up. So theoretically, you should be able to just chase it over like that. It happened just outside that column. You could draw in that last little bit of the bench there. And then all the corners go back to the vanishing point. And you can see that that one ends where the other one ended. We can see more clearly that bench, how long that bench is, just before the end of that door. Actually, not too bad. We've got most everything. You know what we haven't done? Two things we haven't done. We haven't located the bottom of these pillars. So let's do that now. It looks like the angle's about like that. Easy enough. Just take these straight down until they hit that line. So everything's in a lot of shadow there, so you don't need much detail about them. And then these tile wainscotes. Not much to do except for just to do a couple lines to note that they're there. When we go back into ink, we can find things like if we want to put in the doors. But I wanted us to get rid of the major items and help identify how to sketch those. Before we start inking, let's do a couple of things. Let's take a kneaded eraser and just lighten up some of these lines, if you can. It helps you see what all you have there. And I'm going to define my edges before we start inking, because I'd like to not sketch in that bench, and I don't want to forget. Wherever up top you want to cut it off, and then I'm going to bring it sort of low. I like a fairly thin pen. You can use whatever you are comfortable with. If it's a fat pen, though, it's a different kind of sketch. So hopefully you have something that's not too fat. Usually when I'm inking, I will retrace my steps, but I feel like in this case, there's so many things of importance in the foreground, like the chandeliers and the benches, that if I retrace my steps, I'm going to be doing a bunch of lines that we don't normally see. So in this case, let's start out and move back. Might start with some of these arches. And if you're more comfortable turning your book, that's a good thing to do. Also with the arches, because you don't really see that line very well, it's not like it's a dark against light line. There's not much contrast. On the leading edges, at least, of these arches, you might want to dash them in. Use a broken line just to show that it's not as prominent while it's in the foreground. It's not as prominent from a contrast standpoint as the back of it. You see what I mean? So now we're just going through and basically tracing over our underdrawing. We can start adding detail, tonal value. You can see the arches through the light fixtures a little bit. I haven't done it, but if you wanted to, you could go through and draw in some of these bigger light fixtures. It would actually be kind of cool if this one showed up. Just because we didn't draw in that rib doesn't mean we couldn't add him in here. He follows the same rules. He would just get a little bigger. See more of that. Chain going up there somewhere. Up to you. We do see this. I think I'll add this one. I'm not sure I'm going to add that closest one. Interesting. There's some like a little, oh, that's a Santa Fe logo in the light fixture. Kind of cool. But these guys are all getting smaller as they're going back. Very little detail the farther back they go. When you do the doors, notice how you see the wood frame on the far edge, but the stucco wall prevents you from seeing the wood frame on this leading edge. So you'll have more lines there on that far side. See what I mean? And it gives the wall a little depth. Train stations like this are such interesting places. The ceiling is 50 feet tall. If we took Michaela and multiplied her, Michaela is one of our sketchers, and multiplied her and had her stand on her shoulders, we would have 14 Michaelas standing on their shoulders, and then they could touch the ceiling. A person who's 5 foot tall would take 10 of them. There aren't too many places anymore that have such interesting ceilings. You might go to a store with a very tall ceiling, but they're usually flat and very functional. There's not necessarily anything functional about the arches and their ribs. The arch is a strong structural form, so they might have done it for that reason, is that you can get a lot of volume under that arch. But it makes for a very beautiful space. And it has a special feel that it's hard to describe, you just have to go there. It's like trying to describe why churches a lot of times have a special feel for it, feeling in them. They're designed to create awe and wonder and feeling of reverence. Now there's a little detail in that back wall. If you were there, you'd be able to tell what was going on better than just looking at this photo. So I'll just loosely block in some things and not pay it too much attention. But now that you're getting into some of the detail, you can start adding, we don't really have much shadow, we have some reflection. But to try to get in some tonal value, you just look at the space and what are the dark areas, what are the light areas? Um, is there some contrast in there anywhere that you'd like to point out? The ceiling is dark, and that gives an interest, a point of interest. And then I'll show you in a moment about there's some texture in the ceiling that'll help define which direction it's going in. Okay, so we have the purlins that we put in and we did some guideline. If you decided to do the purlins, there's just something interesting in the ceiling that you could add. And they get smaller as they go back, of course. Oops. Okay, not all my purlins are lining up. In between the purlins, there are ceiling boards, roof boards, that are in the same direction as the slope. And so you can add them in. And it helps reinforce that it's a sloping ceiling. and add some interesting texture. Yes, that's the sound of the dog snoring. And the birds chirping. Now I've defined the extent of the sketch. I don't know, you guys ever notice this? My little sketches always seem to have a little twist to them. So the texture in the ceiling, instead of using the arch, you could define the edge of your sketch by that outermost arch, but just going to let the ceiling do it. Kind of an interesting, from a composition standpoint, to have that triangle be the outer edge. Now we do see a little bit, but I'm going to ignore that. I'm just choosing not to sketch that in. You know what I think though? I will do that last light fixture. I guess I was feeling a little more confident. As for some of the details, if you wanted to just, in the light fixtures, add just a little suggestion that there's something going on there with those globes, the glass globes. And at some point, we're going to need to go back in and start to erase some of these guidelines, and we're going to find that there are a few details that we need to add back in. We'll see what we forgot to ink in. You could also add the tile work on those columns. We can't really see that they're tile. I'm just giving it a little tonal value. The tile work is one of the more interesting things when you go out there. Definitely check the tile work. I believe all the tiles were made locally. The for the floor system, if you'd like to give just a hint that, this is a flooring, you could do some radiating lines. You could also do lines that are horizontal, closer together in the back, and then getting farther apart as you come in the foreground. And that's what I might try to do now, is just a few lines. There. Now I think is a good time to take the eraser and get rid of some of the major lines, the pencil lines, and see what we forgot to ink in or where our sketch could use some definition. And bringing out the big guns. Had a lot of pencil line on there. Maybe there's a hint this whole thing looks like it belongs together and it doesn't really. I completely ignored the side of that information booth. I see now that there's there's some sort of one of those, like a kiosk where there's a lot of brochures and things. I might sketch in that clock. Seems like for a train station you'd want a much larger clock. And a little bit in the window. I always like to add where we are. Santa Fe Depot. San Diego. And it's March 2022.